desperation, not knowing where we would be in American politics. It's entitled God Talk, Today in the Public Presidency. So,
well, thank you all for coming. It's really a delight for us to have a chance to talk about this. Amy and I have I'm going to talk about the Kennedy speech before the Houston Ministers Association, and then Amy is going to talk about Mitt Romney's speech for an largely evangelical audience, and that we did that purposefully because I'm more affiliated with Romney, and that's my own religious tradition actually, and Amy's academic interest is in the history of Catholicism, so we decided in the interest of kind of philosophical charity to take views that we're less affiliated and knowledgeable about. So, as Ben indicated, we're starting this particular event as one of a series of initiatives we're developing within our new school. Amy has a film series, Religion Through Film, that she started along with one of her classes. We're starting a student group this afternoon, we hope, and there's other kinds of things down the road. So there's a couple of you that have asked for more information or to know about our website. That Bob Heckner over there does a masterful job of updating the calendar. So with that, I want to say a few things about Kennedy's speech, and as Ben indicated, we sort of set this up to roughly coincide with the recent inauguration of President Obama. When we set this out, not knowing exactly who was going to be the president at that time, but as we think about that inauguration in its wake, I want to at least start with returning to one of the more memorable presidential inaugurations, certainly in my lifetime, and that was Kennedy's inaugural speech in January 1961. And that speech is memorable in large part for some things that, some admonitions that Kennedy gave, such as the torch of liberty has passed to a new generation. The United States will pay any price and bear any burden to advance the success of liberty. And American citizens should not ask what the country can do for them, but what they can do for their country, particularly for, as Kennedy put it, the freedom of man. Less commonly, so those are sort of the highlights that people remember. Less commonly appreciated is that Kennedy situated his work of freedom and liberty within a religious context. He began his speech by acknowledging that the oath of office he was making in his office, he was making the same pledge to American citizenry and to Almighty God that has been prescribed since the national founding. And more importantly, he invoked almost a divine mandate to spread the cause of freedom around the world as a bookend to his speech. He indicated at the very beginning that the issue which led to the founding of the Republic is contested across the globe, namely, quote, that the belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God, unquote. As stated, this claim goes further than any of the founders actually asserted, but we'll leave that to the classroom and decide for the moment. In the midst of the Cold War, Kennedy called on the nations of the world to align with the free world, and also those that were already aligned with the Soviet bloc, to enact the liberating command of the biblical prophet Isaiah. Again, another religious citation in his speech, to undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free. And then he also cited a passage from the Epistle of Paul as part of his summons to the American people. And then his concluding sentence, his bookend, Kennedy asked for the blessing of the divine in this new era of American leadership, and asserts that, quote, here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. So in his appeal to God and to biblical references, he carried on a presidential tradition that does take us back to the inaugural address of George Washington and situating the American role in the world as part of a divine cause. For some persons at the time, perhaps even looking at it now, Kennedy's use of religious language and symbolism was really just of ceremonial significance. Window dressing provided a kind of real religious cloak for the real politic of the Cold War. But others, such as the sociologist Robert Bella, thought that Kennedy was tapping into something different, something that Bella termed, following the phrasing of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that is entitled the civil religion. And the civil religion, according to Bella, involves a set of beliefs, symbols, and rituals that imbue the political realm with a religious dimension. And at least in the 1960s, Bella claimed that there were certain common elements of religious orientation that the great majority of Americans shared. Now, it's really, to me, ironic that Bella makes this claim about what Kennedy was tapping into, because 4 months previously to his inaugural address, Kennedy's own commitment to these commonly shared values and this public tradition had been called into question and publicly potentially jeopardizing his campaign. During the run-up to the campaigns, or run-up to the election, some 392 publications have been issued opposing the election of a Catholic president in the United States. And that frankly continued in a more public form the history in America of long-standing practice of persecution and bigotry towards Catholics. One of the most influential Protestant evangelicals in our history, Billy Graham, opposed the Kennedy presidency because of Kennedy's Catholicism, and he organized 2 meetings of Protestant clergy to voice public disapproval of Kennedy. Following one meeting that Graham convened that was held on September 7th, 1960, 2 months before the election, 150 members of what were called the National Conference of Citizens for Religious Freedom issued a statement that the New York Times covered. It was on the cover page, in which they questioned Kennedy's fitness to lead the country because the Roman Catholic Church was a political as well as religious organization, and it has specifically repudiated on many occasions the principle sacred to us that every man shall be free to follow the dictates of his conscience in religious matters. So the point is that religious freedom on this view was threatened by the election of a Catholic president. The other kind of context I want to provide for Kennedy's speech is one needs to recall that during this era it was a fairly turbulent time in America with respect to religious freedom and issues of establishment, the basic issues of the First Amendment. Some 6 years before Kennedy's speech, President Eisenhower had signed into law the phrase "under God" as part of the Pledge of Allegiance, and symbolically fusing patriotism and religion. And Eisenhower remarked on that event, quote, "From this day forward, the millions of our school children will daily proclaim in every city and town, every village and rural schoolhouse, the dedication of our nation and our people to the Almighty." And then 2 years later, the language of "In God We Trust" was adopted as the national motto, and it began appearing on paper currency shortly thereafter. It began appearing on coinage shortly after the end of the Civil War. In the also, Roman Catholicism had yet to occur sort of the opening to the world of Vatican II, which began its deliberations during Kennedy's term. So this was, again, sort of the background of Kennedy at this. And yet during Kennedy's own term, or his administration, there were 2 landmark rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court that really changed public discourse and sought to undo. There was one focus on religious liberty. These Supreme Court rulings sought to undo government entanglement or sponsorship of religion. So in 1962, a year and a half after the inaugural, in the case of Engel versus Vitale, the court held that school prayer sponsored by the state violated the Establishment Clause. And 1 year later, in Abington versus Shemp, court found readings of the Bible or other public school-sponsored religious activities to be unconstitutional. And Kennedy, he sort of post-inaugural, that he supported these decisions, commenting on the first case that we have here a very easy remedy, and that is that we can pray ourselves. So he supported not having prayer in schools. Now, these two cases, this is looking from our point, they haven't generated what Harvey Cox at the time said was going to happen in American culture, that is the advent of the secular city. But what they did do is renew the religious conservative movement, precipitating ultimately the culture wars that we're heir to. Well, in any case, I mean, that's kind of the background I'll give. And Kennedy's speech comes in September of 1960 before Protestant clergy that have been convened by the Greater Houston Ministerial Association. And he begins by saying this particular issue, namely his religious affiliation, was really a distraction, was really peripheral to the larger issues of the campaign, particularly poverty, the war, and so forth. But because of this challenge to his fitness to be elected as a Catholic president, to be the first Catholic president, and still, if I'm not mistaken, the only Catholic president, Joe Biden is with that. He hasn't been. He's not president. We hope. I would have. Anyway, he felt compelled to sort of make his case, and what he did was sort of state in a series of several propositions the kind of America that he believed in, and was one in which the religious dimension really didn't have a great deal of political or public significance. And this was not lost on, if you recall, Rick Santorum last year in the presidential campaign, who said that Kennedy's account of separation of church and state made him want to, quote, throw up. So in any case, Kennedy's vision of America, the America that he believed in, held that the separation of church and state is absolute. And sort of articulating that, he drew on a particular understanding of the founding and its principles regarding religious liberty. He appealed to the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, authored by Thomas Jefferson and subsequently passed by or ratified in Virginia through James Madison. It was really a formative document, more so than the Constitution, the First Amendment. And then he also obliquely refers to Jefferson's Danbury letter to the Danbury Baptist congregation, which in 1804, Jefferson is the first person to use this language of moral separation between church and state, and there's different ways that that's interpreted. We won't go into them there, but Kennedy does use that, those sort of historical precedents, and those were important for his case, and then he does mention the Constitution's prohibition of requiring or opposing religious tests as a qualification for federal office. He says this has been designed precisely to prevent the kind of intolerance and bigotry that he'd been facing. And then for good measure, he draws on it, he appeals to his Texas audience by saying there was no religious test at the Texas Shrine of Alamo. So again, he's trying to work with several kinds of historical precedents to make his case for the separation of church and state as absolute. And so he felt that these particular freedoms, both religious liberty and freedom of the state from religious influence, were under attack by the threats of the Protestant hegemony over the Catholic congregation and the Catholic presidency. To the extent that they not only defied religious values, but they also defied the sort of non-religious value that can be referred to as the American ideal of brotherhood. In the realm of personal character, apart from sort of this political dimension, Kennedy contested the charge that historically had been leveled at Catholics, that they were disloyal and not to be trusted by the state because their ultimate loyalty resides with the Pope. Even the very influential letter concerning toleration in 1689 by John Locke puts Catholics in the same political category as persons who are subversive of public order, in the same category with Muslims and atheists, none of which have claims of tolerance on the magistrate of the state. So this insinuation of disloyalty and distrust, I think, had to be very galling for Kennedy. And he reminds his audience that the America that he believes in is one that he fought for in the South Pacific, and again, quoting, the kind my brother died for in Europe. He then goes on to explicitly assert that in his vision of America, no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope. And that's a standard he also applied to Protestant clergy and organizations as well. And he further appealed to a formative concept in the founding of the Republic, the notion of conscience, as his primary guide in his presidential decision-making. But whenever an issue may come before me as president, I will make my decision in accordance with what my conscience tells me to be the national interest. And he felt that it would be very remotely, beyond really the realm of remote possibility, but if there was a conflict between sort of the law and his conscience, he would then resign. So his claim, he goes on to say, I do not speak for my church on public matters. The church does not speak for me. In terms of this historical debate about the purposes of the First Amendment, Kennedy certainly recognizes the value of religious freedom, but he takes his position more on the side of the state needs to be protected from, the state is free from religious influence, and that's part of what the separatist interpretation of the First Amendment means. And he would disavow, and certainly disavows the idea of what would be called in our time, what we've heard recently in our political context, that America was founded as a Christian nation. He says explicitly, I believe in America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish. And he seems to even anticipate the sort of evangelical conservative movement that has repeatedly touted America as a Christian nation, founded on biblical teachings and morality. He declares his opposition to efforts by any religious body to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general populace. Ironically, however, as I mentioned, the supports the catalyst for the evangelical appeal and renewal in our period of time are attributable in part to the Supreme Court decisions that occurred under Kennedy's administration. And one biographer has written that Kennedy's, quote, Kennedy's secularism on educational issues contributed to the origins of the Christian right in U.S. politics. Now I just want to pause for a moment and just think about how some recent events would deviate from Kennedy's vision of America, his policy of absolute separation. For example, under the Reagan administration, formal diplomatic ties were established between the U.S. and the Vatican, and an ambassador appointed, and that was something that Kennedy explicitly disavowed and wouldn't go in that direction. At the beginning of his presidency in 2001, George W. Bush, an evangelical Protestant, visited the Vatican for a conversation with the Pope about the ethics and policy of embryonic stem cell research. Kennedy asserted in his speech that no public official either requests or accepts instructions on public policy from the Pope. Kennedy declared himself against state aid for religious traditions or religious schools, but as you know, numerous religious organizations under the past two administrations have received federal funds for the faith-based initiatives. In his presidential campaign in 2004, now Secretary of State John Kerry supported the legal right to abortion, and that brought him substantial ecclesiastical criticism from Roman Catholic, or at least some Catholic clerics. who wanted to deny him the sacrament of communion. And again, that seems to contravene Kennedy's viewpoint that, quote, no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the public acts of its officials. Again, there are certain acts or certain sort of developments in our time that seem to be incongruous with Kennedy's absolute separationist stance. But there are other things that sort of are more suggestive of Kennedy's vision about religious tolerance and equality, even though he couldn't possibly anticipate that at the time. One of the more memorable lines of this speech, he says that religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all. And Martin Luther King would later rephrase that in his letter from Birmingham City Jail: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We haven't realized this aspiration as yet, but we have had small steps made by recent administrations. I think President Bush's effort to distinguish Islam as a religion of peace, as distinguished from al-Qaeda terrorists, was one effort in that regard. President Obama is opening to the Muslim world in 2009. He noted that the first foreign treaty that the U.S. had signed with any nation was with Morocco. The Dalai Lama has been welcomed to the White House despite protests from China. So there's some kind of movements that I think Kennedy would support. He does, as I indicate, advocate absolute separation, but he clearly doesn't adhere to the view that was attributed to him by Santorum, that separation entails a public square of discourse that, as Richard Newhouse has put it, is naked or empty of religious values and ideas. The public square of citizen discourse is not completely secularized for Kennedy, as distinguished from a person that's in political office. That the public square can be open to religious voices, and it's really unimaginable that he would have found the religious symbols, narratives, and rhetoric used by Martin Luther King in his advocacy of civil rights or King's opposition to the Vietnam War as contravening absolute separation. Again, separation for Kennedy occurs at the level of governance of the state, not in the public discourse of the citizens. Now, some 50 years after that, after Kennedy's speech, a candidate for president from another oft-persecuted religious tradition experienced precisely the disdain for more culturally accepted religious traditions that Kennedy decried. Mitt Romney's Mormon faith was portrayed in rather intolerant terms by many in the conservative movement, who did not wish him to be nominated for the 2008 Republican candidate as president. And Romney, as Amy will talk now, look back at Kennedy's speech as a kind of pattern for his own. That our times now are rather different, and so Romney moves a little bit in a different direction than Kennedy did. So, thank you, and now it's Amy's turn to run.
Well, questions for you?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I first want to say thank you to everyone for coming. I'll say this all year, probably for the next 9 years, and I'm so thrilled to be at Oregon State, but I'm also really thrilled to be colleagues with Courtney. The model of collaboration that he's opening for me, but also the way that he's challenging me in certain ways. I don't normally spend a lot of time thinking about political thought or ethics, and so this is a really nice challenge and a stretch for me to move beyond comfortable patterns of scholarship. So
I do want to tell she's an ethical person, even though she's not.
right. Says you.
Yeah.
So, but as Courtney said, there's, one of the things that's really clear is that there's some of a progression or a change, even though commentators at the time that Romney gave a speech in 2007 compared it directly with Kennedy's speech because they were both at least making some claim that persecuted religious minorities shouldn't be subject to a test for public office. The rest of their visions are quite distinct from each other, and I want to highlight mostly Romney's vision, but also go back to Kennedy's speech and see if we can see some contrast to it. All right, Randy Balmer, a noted historian of American religion, recently reflected that in the 2012 election, Mitt Romney rarely spoke what Balmer calls the M word. By that he means Mormonism. But instead, he chose to use opaque phrases like "my church" when speaking about his religious faith. Quote, when asked about his faith on the campaign trail, Balmer observes, Romney's standard responses were, "I'm not a theologian," and "I don't speak for my church," thereby avoiding the M word yet again. Balmer assesses Romney's reticence to discuss Mormonism as an act of political cowardice, arguing that Romney was simply avoiding what he believed to be a politically toxic element of his biography. But perhaps a longer memory of Mitt Romney's political aspirations to the presidency, which stretch back at least a decade, might yield another interpretation of why Romney rarely spoke voluntarily of Mormonism in 2012, and I believe that's because he feels like he dispensed with the issue in 2007. And in that vein, I'd like to return to a speech that Romney gave in his first campaign, in which he explicitly addressed his religious identity and his relationship to the traditions of public office in the United States. So on December 6, 2007, Mitt Romney gave a speech at the George Herbert Walker Bush Library titled Faith in America. In the speech, he discussed in tandem the role of American religion in his candidacy and his view of the role religion played in the nation's founding and in its current structures. The central topic of the speech is the importance of religious liberty, which Romney characterizes as absolutely fundamental to what he calls America's greatness. In fact, Romney's 2007 speech is a veritable ode to religious liberty and its partner, religious toleration. Romney uses the word freedom 13 times in the speech, liberty 14 times, and toleration an additional 4. He evoked the founders, Abraham Lincoln, John Adams, Sam Adams, and even John F. Kennedy, as protectors of the sacred liberty that Americans possess with respect to their religious beliefs. He argued that freedom creates the conditions for religion to flourish. Romney credited religious liberty for the longevity and prosperity of the nation, saying, quote, "The diversity of our cultural expression and the vibrancy of our religious dialogue has kept America in the forefront of civilized nations." So he sees religious liberty literally as the thing that sustains the country and keeps it alive. What's curious about the speech is the extent to which, in a speech extolling the significance and virtue of religious liberty, Romney paradoxically spends as much time bounding or limiting religious liberty as in detailing its permissions. On the one hand, Romney unsurprisingly prescribed what he called radical Islam from the public sphere of tolerable religions. He does so, he explained, because violent jihad seeks conversion through violent means, conversion by conquest, in his formulation. Quote, "These radical Islamists do their preaching not by reason or example, but in the coercion of minds and in the shedding of blood. We face no greater danger today than the theocratic tyranny and the boundless suffering these states and groups could inflict if given a chance," Romney stated. The implication here is that voluntarism is a key component of religion, that people must be free to choose, or perhaps more importantly, reject specific religious perspectives. Radical Islam is unacceptable then because it requires total social compliance with its dictates and uses violent means to silence or marginalize those who do not accept its claims. More noteworthy in the speech on the virtue of religious liberty was Romney's focus on prescribing what he called the other extreme, which he deems equally dangerous to the nation, that is, pure religion and secularism. If radical Islam presents an external threat to America, secularism menaces the nation from within. And here I'm going to quote more at length from Romney's speech because I want you to catch the formulation that he offers. Quote, "We separate church and state affairs in this country, and for good reason. No religion should dictate to the state, nor should the state interfere with the free practice of religion. But in recent years, the notion of separation of church and state has been taken by some well beyond its original meaning. They seek to remove from public domain any acknowledgement of God. Religion is seen as a merely private affair with no place in public life." And I'll come back to this. Language about private affairs is actually something that Kennedy would have voted positively. Then I'll continue with Romney. "It is as if they are intent on establishing a new religion in America, the religion of secularism. They are wrong. The founders prescribed the establishment of a state religion but they did not countenance the elimination of religion from the public square. We are a nation under God, and in God we do indeed trust. Unquote. Okay, so let's ignore for a moment the rather jarring juxtaposition inherent in a religion of secularism, and instead focus on Romney's rhetorical strategy. In his formulation, Romney navigated an area of silence or slippage in the disestablishment clause of the First Amendment to the Constitution. And again, you should know this by heart, but here it is. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We all know this language. The disestablishment clause mentions only the relationship of the federal government to religion proper. It does not explicitly address unbelief, irreligion, or any of its various permutations and flavors that were common at the time the First Amendment was ratified and that are lumped together in the present moment under the general rubric of secularism. To make secularism illicit from a constitutional perspective, Romney must equate secularism with religion to persuade his listeners that, like any other formally established faith, secularism is a violation of constitutional principles. Inherent in Romney's argument is a conflation of the operations of state with the public square. The delegitimation of religious discourse in public domain is equated with the formal establishment of secularism at the federal level. In this rhetorical move, Romney echoed arguments that had been made by evangelicals since the various Supreme Court rulings, actually, that Courtney mentioned, Engel versus Vitale in 1962, Abingdon-Shemp in 63, Everson versus Arkansas in 1968. All of these Supreme Court rulings banned school-sponsored prayer and Bible reading. Evangelicals argued, following on this, that the removal of religion from the official functions of social institutions like schools and courts unconstitutionally restricted the free exercise of religion that was guaranteed by the Constitution. And Romney is evoking this in his speech. He's saying that secularism is itself illegitimate because it restricts the free exercise of religion. Romney's rejection of secularism flowed from a larger vision of the centrality of religion to the democratic experiment. For Romney, religion and freedom are inseparable from each other, necessary co-constituents for the good of society. Quote, freedom requires religion, just as religion requires freedom, he stated. Freedom opens the windows of the soul so that man can discover his most profound beliefs and commune with God. Freedom and religion endure together or perish alone, unquote. But it's not just amorphous religion that sustains the nation for Romney, but also God himself. And for God, God is always a he for Romney. Through his speech, Romney credited the divinity with authoring the nation and its political ideals, and further, with protecting the national state from threats raised against it throughout its history. He referred to God as, quote, the divine author of liberty, and added a further dark implication, a familiar trope drawn from the popular declension narratives of American civil religion, that the nation imperils itself by distancing its discourse and institutions from its divine author. Quote, our greatness would not long endure without judges who respect the foundation of faith upon which our Constitution rests, Romney warned. And I will take care to separate the affairs of government from any religion, but I will not separate us from the God who gave us liberty. In this narrative of American history, explicit acknowledgement of the providential role God has played in the nation's founding and survival is essential to the nation's continued well-being. He's arguing that the nation needs to continue to acknowledge God, or God will withdraw his favor. This is very standard declension narrative. Romney also assigned religion an essential social function in the nation, crediting it with establishing, quote, a common creed of moral convictions that serve as the conscience of the nation, guiding its history, shaping its policies, determining what issues are worth fighting and dying for. Quote, these American values, this great moral heritage, is shared and lived in my religion as it is in yours, Romney explained. Our aspirations, our values, are the self-same as those from other faiths that stand upon this common foundation. And again, you note that he's talking about a kind of common moral heritage shared by people of religious faith. There is no mention of the possibility of people of no religious faith having any standing or contribution to this moral code. One way of interpreting the ideal relationship of religion and the state that Romney describes is to point out that it echoes some of the
the arguments for multiple establishment that proliferated in the new American states at the turn of the 19th century. Here I'm going to be a historian for 5 minutes. Perhaps some historical background could be instructive here. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, individual states, many of whom had some formal form of religious establishment, were forced to reconsider the official status of religion at the level of the state by revising colonial charters into state constitutions. In contrast to the relatively clean prohibition that the First Amendment presented at the federal level, right, there had never been an established federal church, therefore it was really easy to say Congress shall make no law and it's done. For the states, there already were established churches, and so how to disestablish or how to manage that establishment in the new nation was a more complicated issue. All right, so in contrast to the relatively clean prohibition that the First Amendment presented at the federal level, legislative action on establishment at the level of the states was contentious, incremental, and slow, as Anglican and congregational authorities fought against the social and financial demotion that would accompany full disestablishment. So there were some religious leaders who had an awful lot to lose by losing the authority of a state church. In place of single establishment, many states moved toward a system of multiple establishment, in which no one Christian church held a monopoly, yet a plurality of Christian groups could lay claim to official sanction and support of the government. So instead of having one established tradition, you have many traditions that are at least recognized. Those arguing in favor of multiple establishment often claimed that religion was essential to governance because it promoted and undergirded public morality. Less optimistically, single and multiple establishment proponents alike raised the specter of social and moral chaos that would follow in the wake of disestablishment, as mobs of heretics and unbelievers, unchecked by the morality of religion, ran amok in the streets and in the legislative houses. For advocates of multiple establishment, religious pluralism could be tolerated, but as a way to keep irreligion from having a legitimate standing in the halls of governance. If some of this rhetoric sounds familiar to you, it is because Romney's speech echoes at least some components of this perspective, especially in his insistence that religion is essential to the functioning and survival of the American nation, and in his claim that irreligion, what we call secularism in the present moment, presented a clear danger to moral and political stability. Quote, "Any person who has knelt in prayer to the Almighty has a friend and an ally in me," Romney proclaimed. And so for hundreds of millions of our countrymen, we do not insist on a single strain of religion, rather we welcome our nation's symphony of faith, unquote. For Romney in 2007, as for Anglican and Congregationalist divines in the 1790s, faith must be heard in the public spaces and especially in political institutions. If a solo is no longer acceptable, a symphony will do, so long as it holds at bay the silence of the absence of religious faith. The logic and historical narrative that undergirds Romney's suggestion that we be cautious about including secularism under the rubric of religious freedom is clearer when we see it in comparison with the definition of religious freedom that John F. Kennedy offered in his 1960 address to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association, and that Courtney just laid out for us. Again, the 1960 speech by then presidential candidate Kennedy is best known as the occasion when he sought to quell anti-Catholic fears that he would implement Catholic doctrine from the office of the presidency by offering Protestant ministers a clear delineation between public and private obligations of faith. But Kennedy's speech also outlined a distinct vision of how the principle of religious liberty should be exercised in political and social institutions. And here I'm going to quote Kennedy at length. "I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him." Kennedy continued, "I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly on the general populace or the public acts of its officials, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all." whereas Romney presented religious liberty as the divinely sanctioned freedom to acknowledge the providential acts of God for the nation. This is a freedom positively constructed to be actively exercised through religious faith then. Kennedy, in contrast, portrayed religious liberty primarily as a set of prohibitions against giving any religious perspective a privileged place in the political process, public institutions, or acts of public officials. More simply, for Romney, religious freedom requires that religious people and perspectives be active in the national dialogue. For Kennedy, religious freedom requires religious people and institutions to exercise restraint. Note that for Kennedy, the prohibitions fall on all parties, not just those in political office. The separation of church and state places restrictions on the activities of everyone. Catholic prelates, Protestant ministers, churches, schools, religious bodies, the voting populace, Congress, the president himself. There's the implication that everyone in America, no matter what their station, has an obligation to contribute to religious liberty by having restraint in the public sphere. Said another way, Kennedy assigned no positive or even necessary role to religion. Rather, he pressed religious people to voluntarily self-limit the exercise of faith, and in some cases, in order to protect the nation from inappropriate intrusions of secular perspectives and sectarian perspectives, I should say, into the national dialogue. Not only did Kennedy not mention forms of belief or unbelief that are beyond the bounds of toleration. So again, Romney says there's two things we can't really include under religious liberty. We can't include secularism. We can't include radical Islam. Kennedy makes no such equivocations about this. Religious freedom is religious freedom. So again, not only did Kennedy not mention forms of belief or unbelief that are beyond the bounds of toleration, he made no mention at all of secularism, irreligion, or people who claim no religious faith or creed. As a historian, I'd be remiss if I did not address the narrative of American religious history that Romney offered as supporting evidence for his claim that religion was a central component of the nation's founding and maintenance. In many ways, Romney's portrait of the religious commitments and intents of the founders draws from a popular but historically incorrect reading of the Founding Fathers as Orthodox Christians who sought God's blessings for the political initiatives they were initiating. This narrative emerged in the constitutional era, this erroneous historical narrative, during battles over establishment and multiple establishment. As ministers worked to insinuate themselves and religion by extension backward into the story of the American Revolution that was, we should note, profoundly secular in its orientation. So again, Romney gives this reading of a very religious reading of the American Revolution, and yet what he's doing actually is reiterating a narrative about the American Revolution that was created by ministers who were arguing for multiple establishment and reading backwards religious meaning into the revolutionary event. It's like a circle somehow going on here. Romney traversed many of the central tropes of this incorrect narrative, claiming, quote, when the nation faced its greatest peril, the founders sought the blessings of the Creator. And, quote, it was in Philadelphia that our founding fathers defined a revolutionary vision of liberty grounded in self-evident truths about equality for all and the inalienable right with which each is endowed by his Creator. Okay, for reference, historians of American religion reject this narrative that equates because it equates the heavily deist orientation of Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, and Monroe with the more syncretized Christian deism or Unitarianism espoused by John Adams and Samuel Adams. So often this narrative takes one or two more devout members of the founding family and says all of these guys were as religious, and by extension, it somehow prevents us from seeing the really radical levels of deism that many of the founders had. Historians also point out the manipulation of equating deist language of creator and divine savior with Christian notions of an interventionist and saving God, and of highlighting the purportedly religious language of the Declaration of Independence while ignoring the absolute silence on divinity in the Constitution. And Romney does all three of these in his reading of American history. Romney says, quote, we should acknowledge the Creator as did the founders in ceremony and word. He should remain in our currency, in our pledge, in the teachings of our history, and during the holiday season, nativity scenes and menorahs should be welcome in our public spaces, unquote. As with their views of religious liberty, we see the specificity of Romney's historical narrative more clearly when it is set in relief against the genealogy of religious freedom that John Kennedy presented in 1960. So both of them create a genealogical origins for religious history, for religious freedom. And again, Romney says this comes out of the founders, it's divinely sanctioned. Kennedy gives a very different narrative. In contrast to Romney's evocation of the prayers and faith of the founders, Kennedy highlighted only historical moments where the separation of church and state was affirmed or expanded. Quote, "This is the kind of America for which our forefathers did die," Kennedy claimed, when they fled here to escape religious test oaths that denied office to members of less favored churches, when they fought for the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and when they fought at the shrine I visited today, the Alamo. Again, couldn't resist the Texas thing. Kennedy's nod to the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom is especially noteworthy. The Virginia Statute for Establishing Religious Freedom, as Courtney noted, was authored by Thomas Jefferson and ratified by the Virginia State Assembly in 1786 as a rejection of various attempts at multiple establishment in favor of full disestablishment in the state of Virginia. So whereas Romney is almost, to me, evoking the need for a kind of semi-amorphous multiple establishment, Kennedy is really moving back again towards this Virginia model of full disestablishment. The language of the statute, the Virginia statute, is unique because it explicitly refuted the establishmentarian equation of religious liberty with morality. It says, quote, "that our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than our opinions in physics or geometry." The statute tartly proclaims. The Virginia statute also replaced the statement affirming freedom of faith, the one that affirmed the larger category of opinions about religion. And I take it that means opinions about religion include unbelief. Quote, "all men shall be free to profess by argument and to maintain their opinions in matters of religion," opinions in matters of religion, not their faith, "and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities." So in closing, Romney referred to Kennedy's 1960 speech in his own, saying, quote, "almost 50 years ago, another candidate from Massachusetts explained that he was an American running for president, not a Catholic running for president. Like him, I am an American running for president and do not define my candidacy by my religion." And while this comparison is certainly valid, as both men evoke the principle of religious freedom in support of their candidacy, as a member of a sometimes stigmatized religious group, we would do well to attend more closely to the differences between the form and extent of religious liberty that Kennedy and Romney embraced as the American birthright. As I hope my brief comments suggested, in the nearly half-century between the speeches, the American political and social landscape shifted enough that religious freedom as a concept had shifted from being a partner with formal religious disestablishment to leaning perhaps toward an unofficial form of multiple establishment. And I'd be happy to talk about this more. Question time.
Thank you for this. Both of these were really interesting, and it's good to have the historical narratives in both contexts laid out, so it's fresh in our minds. I'm just setting aside the question of irreligion or secularism for a second, and its role in American public life. I'm always struck by so let's leave that and just talk about religion then. The conflation in both Kennedy, well, generally, but in Kennedy and Kerry, the other guy, Romney, oh dear, between religion, God, and then it turns out, I was going to say an Abrahamic notion of God, a God that's sort of shared by Jewish, Islam, and Christianity, but actually not even that. I wonder if, I don't know what to say about that, and so just comment on that conflation. Where are Taoism, Confucianism, Hinduism, and Buddhism in this picture, either from Kennedy and Romney and more generally? To heck with the non-religion folks, even all the religion folks don't even seem to get really to count. Or is that just too conservative a reading of what you're saying?
Yeah, well, I think, at least in Kennedy's time, remember the migration of, or immigration of many of the people people that, from the Asian states or the South Asian states, India and so forth, doesn't come until the mid-1960s, and we don't really get an influx of Buddhist populations, Hindu populations, and so forth. So when he says very explicitly that I don't see the American nation as Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish. I mean, those were kind of the three major bodies at the time, and Islam isn't mentioned there, and I just don't think there was a significant Islamic presence at the time. And again, there clearly wasn't a sort of East and Southeast Asian presence. That comes after the reform of the immigration laws in the mid-1960s. So it is Judeo-Christian, although I don't think it's Abrahamic. I think you're right to say that, at least for Kennedy. And I think there's, as we try to sort of put it together, I know we kind of worked independently on this, but one of the points that I think was common to us is just the shift in nature of American culture, including the pluralism in belief and the pluralism in different cultures that probably wasn't there, in Kennedy's time, but is much more part of our cultural landscape today.
And Romney actually acknowledges that there's actually a quite lovely section in his speech where he talks about the things that he admires about other religious faiths. And so he goes through a list, and again, it's primarily, Christian, or, he likes Catholic, in the Catholic sense of ritual, but he ends up saying he likes the Muslim sense of devotion to regular prayer. So it's not extended a whole lot, but it's broader for Romney. I mean, there is a recognition that religious pluralism has somehow expanded, and even though the realm of acceptable partners in our religious discourse is broader. Not a whole lot broader, but broader.
But you have to kneel down in prayer to your God as a creator again.
To be his ally.
Yes.
I was wondering if Romney's views, or at least his rhetoric, changed significantly in public between 2007 and 2012. Do you have any idea if his views changed? I know his rhetoric became much, well, I don't know.
Well, my sense, coming from that tradition, is that his views probably didn't change, but he felt, there was a particular audience. Both these people are speaking to particular audiences, and that's always important to keep in mind. They're not speaking to a larger public group here. Even a group that's going to attend inauguration, they're speaking to a religious group, whether it's the Bush Library or the Houston Ministerial Association. My sense is that his basic fundamental views about the religious narrative about the founding haven't shifted. I say this in part not because I'm trying to read into it, but my sister has worked very closely with Romney on one of the board of directors, not the one that caused so much problem. What was that again? Yeah, not that one, but Staples office. They run the board of directors together. So I don't think that his sort of formative beliefs about the religious narrative have shifted. I do think that he is much more expansive and inclusive of other religious traditions that came across in this particular faith. Certainly his religious tradition, Mormonism, should lead him to that conclusion, even if it doesn't. I'd be the first to tell him that. I did not, in the interest of full disclosure, vote for him, but not for religious reasons. But he did certainly tone down the issue, for a public audience. If he was in a religious audience, perhaps some of this might have been much more explicit.
Yeah, Randy Ballmer's argument was that actually that toning down the religious rhetoric in the 2012 election made him again seem like he was a political opportunist who had no, of all things, could he just at least stick by his religion? And so, at least Ballmer's reading, which I think is a little extreme, is that if he was willing to kind of fudge the edges of his Mormon faith, then we can't count on him to stand for anything. But, the other thing I wanted to add was that what I find so compelling about, and I didn't have the chance to say this about the speech that Romney gave, is that it is somehow evocative of this moment where the, religious conservatism, evangelicals in particular, who had been motivated by the court cases of the 1960s and developed a, contrary reading of American history, found that it seemed to flow very nicely with also a Mormon, a more traditionally Mormon narrative about the providential origins of the nation. So, just like Catholic conservatives are now flowing into this discourse also, there seems to be this new detente between these religious groups that didn't used to feel so warmly towards each other. And you can see it in this speech that he could speak from, what is a Mormon perspective and be heard very clearly by evangelicals as singing their song.
Or evangelicals are not Mormon.
Yeah.
I think the audience that they were speaking to is very important. In 2007, Romney was a candidate for the Republican nomination, and he was concerned with the Republican base, which would be more evangelical and conservative, and so to compare Romney in 2007 or 2012 is not a real good comparison when he's talking to a Republican base really looking for nomination as when he's seeking the nomination of the president. I think overall that I don't know. I guess I don't know enough about Kennedy or Romney to say what their academic credentials are, but I don't think either of them is a theologian. And Kennedy might have been somewhat of a historian. He at least published history, but and I don't know. But I think in any case, both of them are not creating this narrative. They are reflecting a narrative that exists within the culture that they are addressing, and saying I'm a true believer in this, and Kennedy, it might have been the secular religion was more important than the individual sectarian religions, and for Romney, it's clearly he's identifying with that narrative of the kind of anti-secular and the essentiality of religious belief to the founding of the country. So I don't think you can look at these speeches too carefully and try to think what does it say about the beliefs of those individuals, but it's more a belief about what is the acceptable argument within the audience that they are addressing at the time.
Very good observation. Jim?
I was wondering if you had any comment about what President Obama experienced in his first run for the president. I remember Hillary Clinton, they questioned whether he was truly a Christian or was he a closet Muslim. I remember Hillary Clinton saying, well, as far as I know, from what he says, he's a Christian, as far as I know. And then, that came resurfaced. And I think he also had to respond to this pastor Wright in Philadelphia, had a very, very powerful speech in that context too. So I think he was subject to some of this birthing, religion, question mark, who's he, who really is he,
Yeah, definitely, in terms of his nationality.
That doesn't mention his middle name.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. He was saying, so all sorts of questions. It's striking how many Americans still believe that Obama is Muslim. It's 35% of the American population. Now, a good portion of that are evangelicals, but he certainly went up against a kind of, I don't know if it's bigotry, but it's certainly a kind of intolerance that he had to struggle with. He didn't feel that, in the way that Romney did, that he had to make a speech before a particular audience, or that Kennedy did. And I think that's probably because, the Democratic Party is generally much more inclusive. So I think that's why he doesn't sort of take the faith issue head head on. But when he goes to Cairo, Egypt, in the I guess it's the 5th month of his presidency, and he does use a much more, again, Cairo's a Muslim nation. I mean, he's got a religious audience there. He does use kind of religious discourse in a very interesting way. So, again, audience, as you pointed out, is very critical. But my sense is that although Obama had to deal with certain kinds of outbreaks of anti-Islamic and American xenophobia about his birth and his middle name and so forth, you didn't have sort of the sustained criticism that you did of Kennedy by the Protestant ministers. You didn't have 390 newspaper articles, right, on this in a way that Kennedy faced. And I don't know how many they were for Romney, but Kennedy was quite systematic.
Although for me it does underscore that, even though there is no legal test for political office, there does seem to still be a cultural religious test for political office. So these examples, the pressure, that all of these candidates face for one or another does suggest that Americans are comfortable with a very particular type of presidential candidate and are nervous.
Can you imagine an atheist running for president? Overtly, it's possible, certainly.
Well, you remember the hoopla because the platform of the Democratic National Committee, right, didn't include religious language this time around. They quickly added at the end, and so there really still is quite a lot of public pressure. I mean, I can't envision that now, but 10 years ago I couldn't have envisioned the way the country would look now. So, historians are good looking back, but forward.
At the same time, I think the notion of religious pluralism is important. I mean, now we have, this congressional term, we have the first congressperson that's Hindu, take those of office on the Bhagavad Gita. It's never happened before. Last, whatever it was, 2 terms ago, first congressperson takes the oath of office on the Quran. So there is a kind of broadening. It doesn't quite get to,
But no Jewish
the
folks are ever
question.
going to be president.
What's that?
Let's be clear, no Jewish folks are ever going to be president.
Well, yeah. Kathy, you have a question.
Yeah, my question was about President Obama as well. At the end of every single speech, you'll remember he'll say, and God bless America. And I'm wondering if that's just kind of just rote, like wearing a flag to protect himself from Fox News, or whether it refers to what you were talking about, Amy, about Romney's thinking that if you turn away from God, God could turn away from the nation. I mean, I wonder how seriously to take that. I take it as offensive, but I wonder how it's intended.
Well, I've noted that Obama often will say, God bless the United States of America, which, I guess I take to him kind of parsing this, not speaking for the entire Western Hemisphere, right, or the Americas, but, kind of, for this one particular nation. So it's like perhaps a little humility in there, but, again, but I do assume that that's a political calculation. I have no insight into his kind of personal, faith commitments and how they lead to his views in public life. But I think it's still essential for a president to say that, and for a president not to say that, I think, would kind of raise concern and alarm. So I think, whether or not he has deep emotion attached to that, he says it, and I think he's expected to say it.
Yeah, I mean, for Bella, that kind of language was part of what he called the civil religion, and you really couldn't, he traces us back, a couple of centuries. For some of the presidents, it is a formality, it's a ceremony, and you just do it because it's been done, it's part of the tradition. For others, it's a very sincere conviction.
But as Courtney pointed out, there's a long history of this ceremonial use of religious language, right? Particularly certain of the founders. Washington in particular, but sometimes Jefferson, almost had this duplicity about, they themselves were quite skeptical, but they felt like the nation needed that kind of possibly public religious language, and so they used it opportunistically at moments. And that's sometimes is what gives ammunition to Christian Reconstructionists who want to come back and say that these were profoundly religious men, is that they look at this kind of manipulative use of this language in the public sphere, even though there was no faith behind it, seemingly. So there's a long tradition of it. It's not like, you know, Obama's the kind of first heretic to work against his conscience and that.
Well, there's a couple, I mean, you've had one, so go ahead.
I just, this last fall, saw on LTV a new release that was talking about religion and the founding of our country. It was a now or now mom was quite revealing. I don't know if any of you saw this, but it was worth seeing. It has really interesting facts in it.
There's, to say, I'm very cautious about some of the stuff that's aired on public television now. That there was a documentary created a couple of years ago using, again, a lot of my colleagues in the field of American religious history. They wrote the script for it, they recorded it, and then a producer who felt like religious conservatives would be unhappy with the narrative basically altered the entire thing on the cutting room floor and created a narrative that fits more with this declension narrative of, you know, kind of religious founding and, you know, revivalism is a democratic impulse and all that stuff. So I have now this new kind of caution.
Listen to that and
Yeah.
read it and have some feedback.
Yeah.
We'll just maybe take a couple more questions. I've got a class to go through in a little bit. But
I have an ethical question. Some of
come to the right place.
professional ethical opinion, please. Some of the founders of the United States, some of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were ministers in their faith. It was in the title. It was publicly known. It's historically known that they were religious leaders. Romney is the president of his state, and those of us who aren't Mormon don't understand the term that a president is the equivalent of a bishop in another religion. Is it ethical for someone not to reveal, or someone running for office, not to reveal that they are a high-ranking religious leader?
Well, I would say, one, no, it's not ethical if that was the case. Now, Romney at the time of this campaign, and I believe before the 2008 campaign, wasn't what's called the president, the state president. In Mormonism, that's a lay person. Okay, you don't have any ministerial training, you don't have any theological training. It's Mormonism believes in what's called the lay clergy. So it might not be quite as, duplicitous, but I do think had he been in a religious office at the time and not to reveal it, I think you're quite right to raise the point. It's my recollection that had occurred when he was governor of Massachusetts, not during either of the presidential campaigns.
So if he's retired, clergy, so to speak,
Well,
and he doesn't have to do anything. So I'm thinking Huckleberry, he still calls himself a minister of the Catholic Church.
Yeah. Well, again, Mormonism is a little bit peculiar in this regard. You don't remain. He doesn't still have that office, I guess is my point.
So he serves a term in that role.
Right. You
Term of service,
basically have the term of service, and then you become a regular member of the laity.
It's not permanent
Yeah.
ordination.
Right. It's not a permanent ordination. So
If a person did hold office, they really should reveal that they are a religious leader.
yeah, I think so. I mean, if it's not already public knowledge. So yeah. Sean, go ahead.
I have a question about Kennedy. Kennedy was against a religious test. I'm curious if we could give him more of a test about knowledge claims, because he says that conscience should guide national interests. I mean, when he says
Well, at least in his, for himself.
Yeah, and when he says conscience, because I don't know much about the Catholic Church, Catholic beliefs, but is there some sort of tie to, say, the Holy Ghost, some sort of spiritual information that's occurring there? Or is there a separate secularist version of conscience that's taking place there?
Yeah, maybe you can work. I mean, I work out of traditional conscience too, but you know the Catholic
Well, my
context a
sense
little bit better.
of the Catholic conscience, the concept of Catholic conscience, I mean, it's a very old one, but it was being altered around the time the Second Vatican Council when Kennedy was running, and of course there were all kinds of theological precursors to the council, so the concept of the Catholic conscience would have been destabilized at this time point, but I think it's not an either-or proposition of a secular notion of conscience or something that's, you know, I don't want to say dictated by the Holy Spirit, but I think you know, a kind of a general sense of Catholic conscience in the 1960s would have been that one's conscience can become informed, right, through attending to, you know, religious messages and also by taking in all kinds of information. And so conscience is something that can be developed, but it's neither secular nor entirely religious. It's a faculty that Catholics have a responsibility to continue to develop and exercise. And after the Second Vatican Council, by 1968, Catholics of all stripes could claim conscience even against the Vatican itself. And they would in cases say, no, my conscience leads me to this. So conscience would become ever more powerful for Catholics. In 1960, that wasn't so, but it was still destabilized and drawing on a deep tradition. Is that your sense?
Yeah, and I think also, at least in the history of the discussion of conscience, I mean, the notion of conscience does have a universal dimension. It has a universal moral dimension. And this is where you get, when you go back to Aquinas and Augustine, which, you know, if you're going back long term in Catholic history, I mean, you have this sense of, you know, conscience is sort of the imprint of the divine, and particularly the moral notion, or what comes out of Catholic teaching is natural law. And natural law is somewhat distinct from divine law, or sacred text, or something like that. So there is a kind of universalizing notion in conscience, but there's also at the same time there's a real subjective notion of conscience as well. And when Kennedy's appealing to the notion of conscience, I mean, it's clearly, I think, both this sort of universalizing notion, you can make a claim for your position based on grounds of conscience, but you could, as say, conscientious objectors to the Vietnam War would do some 8 years later and so forth. But there's also, insofar as you're informed by a particular religious tradition or a particular set of experiences, and you suggested there would also be this individualistic dimension of conscience. So it works that you can have an erroneous conscience in Roman Catholicism as well. I mean, it's very multi-textured, and you're right to say that you probed a little bit more than, again, he's trying to make his case before, you know, sort of kind of constituency. He's not a theologian, as was rightly pointed out. Some questions with commitments to Catholicism in general. He wasn't the best Catholic. Jackie Kennedy, the other Masses, so was that. Yeah. But anyway, can I just ask you one question?
Sure.
I want to push you on something. So and I know you're right on the descriptive point that for Romney, secularism violates free exercise of liberty. Okay? But if you call secularism a religion, that brings it within the scope of free exercise, doesn't it? I mean, there's a kind of, now it doesn't have official formal status, I recognize that, but, you know, at least rhetorically.
Wasted by his own part.
Right, yeah, I mean,
No, but except that he talks not about he talks about the establishment of the religion of secularism, and that's where it's dangerous. It's not right. So he could place it in the realm of religious freedom, except that it's illegitimate because it's being established. And there is the implication that this is a belief system, or as he would call it, a religion that
that delegitimates all others, or that pushes others to the side, right?
Yeah.
So that it can't coexist in a way. At
The
least that's how I, do you read it differently?
A little bit, yeah.
How do you read it differently?
Well, we can talk about it. Go
The
ahead.
fallacy of that argument about secularism being a religion is there's a big difference between not mentioning God and saying God is the creator. Similarly, there's a big difference between not mentioning God and saying God doesn't exist. So atheism can be considered a religion, but not mentioning God is not a religion. It's just total omission of religion.
Well, we should, and so,